we are next going to be hearing from our friend Tyler, who's going to go a little bit into the design side of games and talk about games with interesting enemy designs, featuring Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, showing us enemy designs and how you can also think about creating impactful enemy designs for your players. So everybody, please, let's give Tyler a round of applause.
Hello, my name is Tyler Vranizan. I've been an indie game hobbyist for about 10 years and been spending about the last 3 working on a Metroidvania. And one of my favorite games, and the game I've been playing recently, is Aria of Sorrow, which I consider a masterclass in character design, especially in how interesting these enemies are in this game. So I thought it'd be a good idea to reverse engineer some of it, look at what makes them interesting, and share that with all of you. So what does make an enemy interesting? My first impression is that it just has to elicit a sense of wonder. Anything that's unexpected for a variety of reasons, be it the size, the movement, the difficulty it presents in the game, the way it exists in the environment, the super impressive art or impressive rigging, all these things will make the base level of an enemy really interesting. Let's go over a few examples. So Aria of Sorrow is a gothic horror, so pretty much everything fits in that mold pretty well. And there'd be things you'd expect, like skeletons. But the game kicks off with an unexpected skeleton, because maybe you didn't expect a skeleton this big. So I think the big skeleton is good because the art is good, the rigging is good and interesting, it has a bone club and fireballs, and depending on how you're fighting it, it feels more alive because it's as if it has some level of awareness if you're close or far away and how it should behave. And the difficulty fits. It's a very early boss that's pretty easy, and it gives you a reward. So there's all kinds of incentives that make this an interesting enemy. Now this next example, I'm going to start introducing the idea of layers, of what makes an interesting enemy. Now this enemy is interesting because I think it tells a story. I mean, what is this thing? It's kind of up to your imagination as to why this is underwater, what this creature is inhabiting this other creature. It's a pretty interesting one. So you have the somewhat of an isolated story, it is visually interesting, and at this point in the game, this is a difficult enemy. So getting past it, it may force you to just run away. So there is some motivation to interact with it purely to continue as the reward may be on the other side of the map. And I think the core of an interesting enemy is the reward. So in this game, standard enemies that aren't bosses all have their own rewards. You can get experience, and you have the possibility of getting their soul, which will give you a power that relates to the creature. So when you're fighting something like this, it's more interesting because who knows what skill you'd get, from a creature like this. So it doesn't hit every layer perfectly, but it hits enough of them that this is the next an example I'll enemy. break down is probably one of my favorite enemies in the game, the Headhunter. This is just an excellent enemy, and I should also mention that every boss and enemy in this game exists in a game with a great fighting mechanics. There are a lot of items, there are a lot of weapons, there's a lot of armor and power-ups and skills. So everything exists in a game that feels great to play. I'm not going to get too into any of that, but that probably is something necessary for any enemy to truly be great. Now, the Headhunter's audio engineering is excellent, and visually it's a super interesting character, and also very inspired. And when I read about this on the Castlevania wiki, it seems like it is inspired by possibly a number of sources. There is a Wizard of Oz book that mentions a princess, a very vain princess who collects and wears heads, has a collection of 30 that she's seeking to increase. And there's a Dungeons and Dragons character who can wear and swap heads and wants to collect them in order to live longer. So either way, it's just a very cool idea. And paying homage to cool ideas seems like one fast track to interesting enemies. And this boss has 3 forms by swapping heads, and all of which are rigged well and are interesting in combat. So layer-wise, it is a story within a story, and it seems fitting as a creature that exists in Dracula's castle with its own interesting story in a vacuum. Visually, it's super well rigged 3 times over. The head swapping is well rigged. Basically, it seems like an enemy that took a lot of effort to develop, but was executed super well, so the payoff is huge. The difficulty is high, but that seems intentional, as this is probably an enemy you're going to have to give multiple attempts to, which is good for the game because they're showing off a really polished enemy. And the reward is high on this enemy as well. You both get passage through the map, and you get one of the more interesting power-ups in the game. One that rewards you based off how many souls you're collecting. So all in all, just a really strong enemy, and one of my favorites. So let's look at another enemy who exists in a vacuum. This is called Legion, and from what I read on the wiki, it's based on a biblical story of Jesus dealing with a demon made of many. And this character does show up in many Castlevanias, so this is kind of just one really interesting interpretation of something that exists in this universe. And I'm just going to go ahead and just break down the layers immediately. So, like I said, story-wise, this exists in a vacuum on its own story. There's a graveyard that leads up to this enemy, where you're following characters into it, enemies that don't hurt you, making really ominous noises. So there's a lot of environment and storytelling going on. And it's really visually, this extremely interesting environment is what leads to a high degree of visual interest. There's also many layers as you fight the enemy. There's just a lot of dimension, texture. There's a lot going on that I think succeeds really well. Difficulty-wise, the difficulty is high enough to require some level of planning. In this example I'm playing, I lost, but it's possible to succeed just by playing carefully. So not too difficult, not too easy, pretty strong. And reward-wise, you get passage and a sweet laser weapon. So overall, this is another enemy I consider just really strong, a great example of a high level of creativity and execution. 10 out of 10. The next and final example I'll be discussing is an enemy who has extreme context. The final boss, someone you need to beat to complete the main story arc, resolve the game, really the ultimate reward, and just wrapping everything up. And when we're talking about Castlevania, that's almost always Dracula. In this game, it's not really much different. This boss is relatively easy in comparison to other bosses in this game. At this point in the game, you're very likely powered up. It's more of exercise of what you've collected and a visual treat. So what I really gleaned from this is that this is where all your creative juices are really flowing. This is where you're able to fully express artistically on a main stage. This is hopefully the climax of everything. So I would consider difficulty not as important here, more about having a lasting exclamation point. In terms of how this game actually is, the example I'm showing now, there's many endings, but this is the first one that could be a main ending. So layer-wise, we have something extremely important to the story, so strong marks there. Visually, really interesting. Difficulty is not the highest, which I'm totally cool with this part of the game, and it probably has to do with the skill set of what I have equipped with this character, and the reward is huge. You're either ending the game or you're forking off into another ending. So you can't really go wrong with having a highly visual, highly interesting end to a game. So now that we've gone over some examples, what did we learn? Well, number one, you're going to want to get some big skeletons in your game. And if that doesn't work, you're going to need an inspired enemy, which is the best kind of enemy. So get inspired by the things you find interesting. Humans are great storytellers, so don't be afraid to draw from historical tales that you find interesting. Just find something that will tell a story that the player can be engaged with, and something that, if they're paying attention, has a payoff. And you're going to want to find something that exists in your universe that will invoke a sense of wonder, most likely from unexpected things. In a 2D Metroidvania, it seems like size, movement, and rigging can be really effective. Having an enemy with a visual hook is necessary. Make sure the difficulty is bearable, but not challenging. I really didn't scratch the surface on gameplay with this talk, but it seems like ultimately you want an enemy to be interesting enough that the character has to think about them as if they were somewhat sentient, a real entity that has to be beat. The more difficult it feels in the context of the game, the better. And then have a great reward. There has to be some kind of payoff, even a potential payoff. Something that can give a satisfying core to the enemy. And I'll just leave off with a few clips of my in-progress indie game, which you can check the progress of on Twitter, twitter.com/Sungorth, which I think has really interesting enemies, and I'm still working on fleshing out a good-feeling game around them. And just to prove that I'm not full of it, the game does have giant skeletons. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Portland Indie Game Squad. I hope this was interesting. I hope if you haven't played Castlevania's Aria of Sorrow, you check it out. It's a great game. And thank you so much for listening.
Sungorth.
All right. Thanks so much, Tyler. That was great. I love seeing all those enemies, revisiting them, and having somebody explain why they're so interesting and why they're great, because I totally agree. Really appreciate the graph or the chart and everything like that too. That kind of layer breakdown and everything like that really works. And honestly, I think everybody, if you have an enemy-based game, should maybe think about taking some of this advice to heart as you are working on your game. I should say for your Game Jam game as well, because I think not only is that advice really good, but I think it's honestly very easy to follow. It's really easy to see a giant skeleton and realize that there's something special about that, especially as the game's first boss. It's just like, yep, haven't seen this before. So that was great. Symphony of the Night is the PlayStation 1 one. The DS ones are Dawn of Sorrow and Portrait of Ruin. Both are pretty good. I think Dawn of Sorrow might be my favorite. Portrait of Ruin is great and it's big, but I think it gets repetitive. That's just me personally. Anyways, thank you so much, Tyler. That was a good masterclass in I'm reading Eric's name from the chat right now. In enemy design. In Eric design. Let's design some Erics, everybody. A giant Eric, always gonna turn heads at the beginning of your game.